Answering a threat or pushing for regime change. President Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal has raised fears of a dangerous new conflict and exposed a growing rift with European allies. Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to the program as we take a look at America's dangerous game, rejecting an international agreement and turning its back on diplomacy. Over the next hour, we examine the motives and consequences of Trump's new policy of confronting Iran. Hello from Washington. He took the unprecedented step of violating an international agreement, and the fallout is barely beginning. Donald Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal and impose the toughest possible sanctions threatens to have consequences that could long outlast his presidency. It was his most radical foreign policy move so far, one that could set the US and the region on the path to another war, and just the latest move to pit the United States against the international consensus. On this program, we examine the reasons behind the withdrawal and look at the consequences for America and the world. But first, a look at how President Trump ended up ditching the deal on Iran.
People know my views on the Iran deal. It was a terrible deal. It should have never, ever been made.
We signed it, both the United States and France. That is why we cannot say we should get rid of it.
We will neither outsource our security, nor will we renegotiate or add on to a deal we have already implemented in good faith.
Tonight I'm here to tell you one thing. Iran lied.
The deal we have in place now, today, the only existing deal for the moment, is working.
Working with our European friends, we think we can be tougher on Iran, but not throw away the heart of the deal.
What do you think is going to happen to that agreement? That nuclear agreement?
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
The European Union regrets today's statement by the President of the United States of America.
We have a disagreement over the efficacy of the Iran deal, and that's the reason that President Trump exited from it.
Britain will remain a party to the JCPOA.
The JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, should stay.
Fully supports President Trump's bold decision today to reject the disastrous nuclear deal with the terrorist regime in Tehran.
Deutschland, Frankreich und Großbritannien haben die Entscheidung getroffen, dass wir uns weiter diesem Abkommen verpflichtet fühlen.
L'accord, non seulement il n'est pas mort, mais il a été validé par le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies à l'unanimité.
همه آنچه در برجام خواست ملت ایران بوده به دست آوریم.
Well, as others scramble to save the deal, one major concern is the potential for a new conflict in the Middle East. President Obama has warned his successor that abandoning his diplomatic approach may have increased the threat of war. And that is the focus of our big idea. Here's Jamal Abdi from the National Iranian-American Council on why he thinks that while diplomacy works, military options will not.
The United States gave diplomacy a chance with Iran and actually sat down across the negotiating table from the Iranians, and we actually got a nuclear deal. Ground zero of diplomacy with Iran is maintaining the Iran nuclear deal. The beauty of the Iran deal is that we have evidence of Iran's nuclear program. 10 IAEA reports verify Iran is complying with the deal. We have very powerful vested interests that do not want to see any sort of U.S. rebalance in the region. Players like Netanyahu, like the Saudi royal family, who view the potential of the United States having a relationship with Iran as a bigger threat than anything Iran actually portends. The reality is that this is about regime change. And if that's the case, there's no use in negotiating because you can't negotiate a regime change. What John Bolton and others are talking about now is to try to engage in some sort of covert war inside of Iran, propping up terrorist groups, ethnic separatism, covert activities that would then likely spill out into regional skirmishes as Iran retaliates. The track record for diplomacy is a positive one. And unfortunately, we now see the Trump administration throwing a playbook away that worked. Pressure and ultimatums only end in military confrontation and war. Diplomacy is how you get political solutions that actually avoid those scenarios.
Well, the dangers of a regional confrontation have already been made clear. Just hours after Trump's announcement, Israel launched a wave of strikes on Iranian positions inside Syria. It was claimed to be in response to rocket fire on the Golan, territory illegally occupied by Israel. And within days, there was violence over another of Trump's decisions on the Middle East, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Like the Iran policy, this was staunchly supported by Israel and has led to the deaths of many Palestinian protesters shot dead by Israeli security forces. So much to explore and discuss with our two guests. Gareth Porter is an investigative journalist and historian specializing in U.S. national security policy. His latest book is Manufactured Crisis, the untold story of the Iran nuclear scare. And Michael Pregent is a former U.S. intelligence officer who is now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he is a senior Middle East analyst. Michael Pregent, as a former Iraq intelligence advisor, I think you'll remember, as all of us do, how U.S. intelligence, quote unquote, about Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction took this country and the region, in fact, the whole world, down a very slippery slope, selling the case for war with very dubious, highly politicized intelligence. Sounds awfully similar to what we're hearing now. It looks like this might be happening all over again, this time with Iran's nuclear weapons. Is that the case?
No, it's not the case at all. I disagree with the premise. Yes, bad intel on the nuclear aspect, but solid intel on the biological and chemical weapons program that Saddam had. The biggest problem with U.S. intel is that the National Security Agency believes everything it hears if the other side isn't aware they're being collected on. Saddam had a deception campaign. In signals intelligence, he told the Iranians he had a nuclear program. Our National Security Agency believed it as well. It turned out to be false. Now,
well, I think it can be argued whether everyone believed it or not, but the bottom line is many people around the world felt that it was misleading information. But just forwarding to today,
sure.
It seems to me and many other people looking at the Iran nuclear issue is the big problem here is that the Trump administration is actually going against the IAEA's findings, going against international consensus, in fact, going against its own intelligence.
Well, the deal with the Iran deal is the IAEA has told us we will not inspect these military sites not protected by the JCPOA, even though we provided imagery showing military activities at these bases.
But we're not talking about military sites. Let's focus on the nuclear.
We're talking about the
part
ones
of this.
focused on the nuclear weaponization of the program. It's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay,
we're talking about places like Parchin and Fordo that aren't supposed to have activity. We provide imagery to the IAEA, and they say they refuse to be a political arm of the United States.
So are you saying the Secretary of Defense of this country, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff,
Yes, I am.
U.S. intelligence agencies,
Yes.
the State Department, the UN Security Council, even some Israeli intelligence officers, including the IDF's Chief of Staff, who believed the deal was working, verified, they are all wrong?
Yes. Now, I was in the intelligence community, and I disagreed with a lot of intelligence analysts that said these things weren't happening. It's as simple as looking at highly compartmentalized intelligence to see what's happening. Pompeo had access to that as CIA director. The director came out and said, after Mattis said that Iran was in compliance, that Iran was in fact cheating.
Well, let me just tell you that Pompeo, at his own confirmation hearing just now in April, at the Senate, in fact, admitted that Iran was in compliance. Gareth Porter, what do you say? Because clearly the Trump administration isn't reading its own reports or couldn't care less what is in them.
A couple of things about the idea that Iran is not in compliance. First of all, remember that Parchin was one of the places that the IAEA did visit through, remote cameras. They were there on the scene watching the Iranians go in. They went wherever they wanted to go in Parchin. They found nothing. They took samples. They found nothing. There's nothing in Parchin, okay?
It's the activity afterwards. It's not that activity there. It's the activity afterwards.
But let's separate fact from fiction.
But the second point is that you can have visits to military installations under the JCPOA. You could, past tense. You could have done it had it continued. That was not the issue. There was, of course, a procedure to go through, but they could go and visit and take samples and find out if there had been any.
Could not take samples. Iran had to provide the samples. That was in the agreement. Iran was able to provide the samples. They were not able to get their own samples.
But you have the most robust verification mechanism, snap inspections. No other country has apparently ever subjected itself to it.
It's not
Gareth Porter, to you on one point. I mean, clearly there are many like Michael Pregent and plenty of people here in the administration, clearly President Trump in the White House behind us, who believe that Iran was not in compliance, regardless of what everyone else has said. Where does this administration get its facts from then?
Look, I have a slightly different slant, maybe a very, very different slant on the Trump administration's position on this. I think they defeated this agreement not because of intelligence, but because of politics. And I think they did it by having an argument that was emotionally powerful, which is that the Iranians lied about not having ever had a secret nuclear weapons program.
You've looked at the facts.
I've looked at the facts. My whole book, Manufactured Crisis, is an investigative history of the Iran nuclear program. And what I found was that the reality is that Iran has not really wanted to have nuclear weapons because it is a Shia-governed country and they are illegal under Shia Islam. And during the Iran-Iraq War, they were not allowed to have even chemical weapons, despite the fact that Saddam was hitting not only their cities, but their military forces, but their cities with chemical weapons because it was not allowed under Islam.
But beyond their intention, what do you then make of the fact that Netanyahu has come out with what he's called a massive Israeli treasure trove of Iranian secret files, half a ton, I believe, of secret Iranian nuclear documents that he says constitute a major intelligence coup? What do you make of that then?
What I make of that is that this is a continuation of a long-term Israeli disinformation campaign that began in 2002, 2003, continued with turning over these so-called laptop documents to Western intelligence. I have the story from a former senior official of the German Foreign Office about how the BND, the German intelligence agency, told him that they knew all about these documents. They came from the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. They were handed over to them by the MEK. The MEK at that point was a client of Israel's Mossad. And these documents I've shown in my book have indications of fraud that are unmistakable. They have the wrong missile warhead or reentry vehicle portrayed in these drawings that supposedly showed that Iran was mating a Shahab-3 missile with a nuclear weapon. It could not have been authentic, as I've shown in my book.
So, Michael, given what you've just heard, and given the fact that, as Gareth Porter has just mentioned, this information might have come from a very sketchy, dubious type organization known as the MEK, which incidentally was on the State Department's list of terror organizations up until, what, 6 years ago?
Yeah, for something they did in 1978.
Well, and a group that's highly supported by the likes of John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Rudy Giuliani. I mean, how concerned should you be that information like this should be funneled by a group that is less than authoritative on this, shall we say, and that it could actually influence U.S. policy in the region?
You could say the same thing about the Iranian regime and the IRGC Quds Force. Are they good messengers when they say they're not cheating?
Well, except that the U.S. is not relying on its intelligence.
Well,
but you seem to be in this case.
We're relying on their reputation. Now, everybody says the messenger is corrupt because it's the MEK. But the message is solid. Now, when it comes to the photos you're talking about, I get those all the time. And I go back and say, you're not helping your cause when you give me a photo that I can upload and verify to be inaccurate, to be a bad photo. So
Mike, I'm not talking about the photos. I'm talking about the documents, the laptop documents that were turned over and became basically all of the evidence that was used to convict Iran.
I'd have to see those in order. I'd have to see those. I've seen the photos, so I'm just talking about that. Okay, haven't seen that, but
But are you concerned, though, as an American, that
I'm concerned about disinformation and spin
that the
as an American.
That the U.S. may be using this type of intelligence, which I think many people would suggest only seems to be to the benefit of Israel in the region. Are you
We did not
concerned
rely
at all?
on Netanyahu's treasure trove to tell us to walk away from the Iran deal. The president was already going to walk away from the Iran deal. What Netanyahu did, go ahead.
But Trump cited Netanyahu's intelligence.
You cite it because it briefs well to Americans. It's good. I mean, it's a good TV event, right? The president was going to walk away. The same week the president's going to walk away, Mattis testifies that Iran is in compliance. that we shouldn't walk away from the Iran deal because it's against our national interests.
Matt is the Secretary of Defense.
Pompeo, after he testifies and says, hey, Iran is, whatever, he goes to Netanyahu, talks to him. They do this great presentation for an audience of one. That audience was President Trump, okay? So Pompeo then, after being confirmed, says what he says, that Iran is in fact cheating.
And so is this all about regime change? Because it sounds like the neocons are back. You're familiar with what happened in Iraq. It sounds like that project of changing the regime in Iran is now alive and well. And it had been stopped.
It's alive and well with the protesters. It's alive and well with the people of Iran. The more we stay out of it, the more likely the regime is to fall. If we get involved, we could actually solidify that base in support of the regime.
And yet John Bolton, National Security Advisor, obviously is pushing that idea. I have a feeling he's running up against Trump's resistance. I don't think it's going to work.
You mentioned ballistic missiles. But if Iran has ballistic missiles, so do Israel and Saudi Arabia. And they have missiles that could actually reach Iran. So
why shouldn't Iran have ballistic missiles?
I mean, is the
because
deterrence
it's a violation of current UN Security Council resolutions.
Come on, Mike.
It is.
Come
it
on.
is. You can't say
that's an expression of U.S. diplomatic power. Fine, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of actual security.
It's a UN Security Council resolution that they're in violation of, along with putting
But who is in violation of? Because it sounds like the Americans are in violation of this agreement right now. Because the JCPO
show me
was
the
a
UN Security Council resolution that says America's in violation.
The JCPO, the Iran deal. But let me just end on this note, if I
signatory
can.
cannot be in violation of something if it walks away.
Because it seems to me that Iran's compliance with the terms of the agreement, and no one really can dispute this except the U.S. administration has and the Israelis.
Right.
And of course, the Saudis have welcomed it. I mean, it seems like, again, the Israelis, the Saudis have been itching for confrontation, military confrontation with Iran for quite a while. What do you make of the doomsday scenarios that we could actually all be heading toward a major conflict here?
Well,
World War III, some people
I think the problem is not so much the Saudis, in fact, but the Israelis. They're the ones who have worked so closely with the Trump administration. Since last December especially, there was an agreement between the two governments on a whole series of steps that would be taken. So what we're seeing in Syria today is clearly a reflection of an agreement between Israel and the United States. I think the problem is Israel is the most aggressive militarily in the Middle East, has been for generations. It's still the case today.
Happens when you're surrounded on all sides by
a discussion we could carry on for quite a while, but we must leave it here. Gareth Porter, Michael Pregent, thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
Announcing his decision, President Trump told the Iranian people that America stands with them, even though it intends to impose the highest level of sanctions against Iran. Restarting sanctions will undoubtedly make things tougher for Iranians in an economy already suffering from high inflation and high unemployment. Many people never saw the economic benefits the deal was meant to bring. So how might Trump's latest intervention affect sentiment on the street? We got the view from Tehran.
من به عنوان یک شهروند ایرانی از آقای روحانی انتظار داشتم همونطور که کشوری که مثل آمریکا توی برجام از این توافق بیرون اومد آقای روحانی هم میتونست بیرون بیاد از این توافق.
فشار بیشتری به مردم خواهد آمد. دوباره میگم راههای قاچاق و همین دور زدن ها و اینها احتمالاً باز میشه.
مردم باید یه مقدار صبر و حوصله و تحمل داشته باشن. انشالله این مشکل هم مثل مشکل‌های دیگه با قوت خودش پشت سر خواهیم گذاشت.
بله و این دفعه میدونم که تهدیدهای یعنی تحریم‌های خیلی بدتری رو قراره که انجام بدن. ما زمانی که تحریم بودیم خیلی سخت بود، گرونی و همه چی، الان هم دیگه بدتر از اون روزا. خب 100% دولت ما بیشتر مقصره، به خاطر اینکه حالا اگر با این قضایه یکم کنار بیاد گفتگو کنه، یعنی باید به فکر بیشتر مردمش باشه تا اینکه خواست خودش باشه، ولی متاسفانه دولت ما فقط به فکر خودشه، به مردم هیچ فکری نمیکنه.
از طرف ایران اون حالا حسنیت نشون داده شد و این معاهده باید انجام میشد، ولی آمریکا اومد معاهده رو زیر پا گذاشت و از برجام خارج شد.
ببینید دو طرفه است. به نظر من ما نمیتونیم مرتب بگیم مرگ بر آمریکا.
من نگران نیستم. ایران اگر بخواد بزنه با یک موشک، با یک دونه موشک خود امریکا رو میزنه. فکر نکنیم.
Joining me now is Robert Malley, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group. He was a key U.S. negotiator in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President, as well as White House Coordinator for the Middle East. Rob Malley, you were, as we just pointed out, one of the key negotiators in this deal, working quite closely alongside the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry. Even back then, it seemed like certain countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, were lobbying hard against this deal. How hard was it to build the level of trust that allowed you to make the deal happen in 2015? How difficult would it be to restore it now?
So as we always were saying, this was not a deal based on trust. I mean, you don't have over 100 pages between parties that trust each other. So there was no trust. By the way, it was mutual.
But you have to trust that the party that signs the agreement will stick to it, though.
Or you have to have verification measures, which make it very hard for them to walk away. And they didn't trust us either, by the way, and I don't think they trusted us till the end. And they were saying, how do we trust that your next president is going to respect the deal? They turned out to be more right than we were. But it was hard, and it's going to be extremely hard to restore anything at this point because it's not a matter of trust. At this point, the Iranians simply going to be convinced that they can't rely on whatever's on paper if the next administration could tear it up.
And from their perspective, they took a leap of faith because the hardliners, as you know, are now arguing that...
We told you so.
We told you so all along. You never should have trusted the US or the Europeans for that matter. So do you think that JCPOA can still survive without the US in it? Do you think the Europeans, France, Germany, the UK, will be able to resist to Trump and those secondary sanctions that he's threatening them with?
So I don't know if they can, but they should try. And that's what Crisis Group has been arguing. And actually, we put out a report knowing this day would come. So about 2 weeks ago, we put out a report saying, this is what Europe has to do to save the deal. They may not be able to.
What should they do? What can you tell us that you've told them?
The goal is to immunize European business from the impact of US extraterritorial sanctions. And that means building a firewall. It means giving guarantees. It means making sure that if a company is going to be sanctioned by the US, the Europeans will protect it. It means telling the US, we want an exemption for our companies because otherwise we're going to have a possible trade war. So whether it will happen, who knows? And whether it's going to be enough to keep the Iranians in, that's a different matter.
And leaving the extraterritoriality of this whole thing aside, the fact, I mean, that the French and others are up in arms, that the US should even impose those types of sanctions on their own companies. What happens with the Chinese, for example?
So the Chinese are more likely to ignore what the Americans are doing, as are the Russians, because they have less interaction with the US.
But will the US even threaten the Chinese, do you think?
Who knows? I mean, you know, we heard John Bolton yesterday say, we'll see what happens and we might sanction. You know, it depends. If people really stand up to the US and say, we are prepared to work with you when we're working together, but if you make a unilateral decision, we're going to have to protect our interests. I think that's what's at stake here. And some Europeans have said right now this is an issue of protecting European sovereignty.
And without these economic benefits, frankly, what incentive will the Iranians have to stay in the deal?
Well, that's why the key is to give them enough economic benefits because they're going to lose some. Once the US withdraws, a lot of the businesses are going to choose not to do.
Knowing them as well as you do, you've negotiated with them for years. What's your best?
I think there's a debate, very intense debate going on there. The more the Europeans do, the more those who are arguing for staying in the deal are going to be able to make their case. But it's going to be a tough call because, as you say, many are telling them, we told you so, and many think they're going to have to retaliate for the US decision, no matter what the Europeans do. But the Europeans have a huge responsibility here, as do other countries.
But they will also want to keep the onus on the United States and show that they, in fact, have not violated this agreement.
That's what you have, what the deal has going for it, is that the Iranians are going to, some Iranians are going to say, let's make sure that US is isolated, not us. Let's make sure that we keep our end of the deal and that the US is violating it. And let's make sure we can convince the Europeans to work with us rather than line up with President Trump against us.
And what is the logic to the reimposition, not just of any sanctions, but the highest level of sanctions, as Trump put it, because we've had sanctions for years against Iran. Well,
Listen,
the end result didn't quite happen for the US.
I think you have a mix of interests, a mix of intentions, and you know, for President Trump, it's about undoing what President Obama did, and it's about showing that he's tough. For others, it's about simply depriving Iran of resources. For yet another group, it's about trying to destabilize Iran and maybe accelerating some kind of regime change. All of them come together with the least common denominator, which is let's at least get rid of this deal and reimpose sanctions. But it's a roll of the dice what this is going to yield.
Looking at it from a distance, though, I mean, you negotiated the deal as part of a big delegation 2 years ago. Looking at it now, Do you see any sort of justification to those who say it is actually a bad deal?
You know, I'm usually not somebody who has absolute certainty about anything in life. On this case, I feel very confident that it was a very strong deal, that it achieved exactly what people who were pressing to be tough on Iran said needed to happen, which is to roll back their nuclear program. It did it in a very effective way. We brought together the French, the Brits, the Germans, the Russians, the Chinese. Some of the, France, which had a very tough line towards Iran, we managed to find a way to go forward. It did exactly what it intended to do. And those who want to tear it up are not tearing it up because it's not achieving its goal. They're tearing it up for other reasons that we're very well familiar with.
And of course, there's that familiar thread as well about what's going on in Iran and what is actually now happening in Jerusalem and the wider Middle East, and the possible conflagration of all these factors leading to very serious consequences. How do you look at the fallout from Trump's U.S. Embassy move decision to Jerusalem and the Iran deal coming together to create quite an unprecedented situation?
Quite a perfect storm. I mean, this is really the week of living dangerously, but living dangerously for no good reason, other than, either in Israel's case to do what it's doing and for the U.S. to support that agenda, or because President Trump wants to undo the legacy of President Obama, or because he wants to live up to commitments he made to his own political base. But it really is creating a perfect storm where you have tensions with Iran, tensions with the Palestinians. We're going to see what happens with the march, what will be the fallout of what's happening in Gaza. But already the death toll is extremely high. These are self-inflicted wounds. The decision on the embassy, the decision on the Iran deal, the self-inflicted wounds that are going to make a combustible region even more explosive.
And why then do you think that this administration is bent on so casually, some would say recklessly, rubbing it in, taking these decisions at the same time, at a time when the region can do without?
So I think that the dates may be a little bit coincidental, but there clearly is a view that they need to shake things up in the region, that they need to be much tougher with their enemies. And, I don't want to make the parallel is not exact, but back in the Bush administration, there also were people who had this notion of constructive chaos. It might not be the same, but the results may be quite similar.
And just finally, under the Clinton administration, you worked very hard toward possibly getting to a deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Now we just hear Rudy Giuliani, one of the president's closest advisors, quite unashamedly say the other day at a public rally that doesn't matter, that regime change in Iran is far more important than any kind of peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians. What does it say about the priorities of this administration and its respect or lack of respect for international law, for established U.S. policy, and for the whole notion of justice in this region?
This is a long discussion. Certainly this administration seems to be throwing a wrecking ball to the region and doing it for ideological reasons or for personal reasons, but reasons that have very little to do with the interest of stability in the region, with the well-being and the prosperity of the people of the region. And by the way, I would say that includes Israelis themselves, because in the long run, the kind of tensions, the polarization, the escalation between Israelis and Palestinians is a huge disservice to the Palestinian people. It's also a disservice to the people of Israel.
Rob Malley, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still ahead on the program, held captive during the 400-day Iran hostage crisis, we hear from a veteran U.S. diplomat who has a unique view of relations with Iran. And breaking one deal and making another, we'll look at the possible consequences for talks with North Korea. Welcome back. Now to the other countries remaining in the Iran deal. President Trump's decision was cause for concern, but not everyone was unhappy. Saudi Arabia was among the nations to give their backing. It has been leading a renewed effort to counter and contain Iran, pushing back against what it sees as Iran's expanding influence. And now this regional rivalry is having far-reaching effects. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is reshaping the Middle East. Iran's influence now extends to Syria, where its military support has helped President Assad in the fight against armed groups and terrorist organizations like Daesh and others. In Iraq, it has exerted power through influential militias. Iran is the main supporter of Lebanon's Hezbollah, the powerful militia and political party that is part of the coalition government. And in Yemen, Iran is accused by its enemies of arming local Houthi rebels in the war, though Iran denies this. But it is Saudi Arabia which is leading a military coalition against Yemen's Houthis, with direct intelligence and military support from the United States and arms from the UK, France and others.
The UN says at least 10,000 Yemenis have been killed and calls Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Saudi Arabia has tried to intervene in Lebanon, apparently forcing its Prime Minister Saad Hariri to resign during a visit to Riyadh last year. Hariri withdrew that resignation weeks later. The opposition to Iran is bringing Saudi Arabia and Israel closer. The two countries have no official diplomatic relations, but there are now signs of a growing relationship. The opposite has happened in Qatar, where Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies have imposed a blockade. Top of their list of complaints, Qatar's close ties with Iran.
Well, one person with a unique perspective on Iran is Ambassador John Limbert, a veteran U.S. diplomat who was held at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran during the hostage crisis in 1979. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran under the Obama administration. Ambassador Limbert, you spent 444 days as a hostage in Iran, but that was 40 years ago. So when you hear President Trump talk about Iran's hostage-taking and malign activities as part of his justification for getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, what goes through your mind?
Well, it's clear. It's very clear that events of 40 years ago, they still haunt the relationship between our two countries. And when under President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry, we made some tentative steps to changing that relationship into something more productive for both sides, the ghost didn't go away.
Didn't go away, and does it justify in any way the continuing suspicion?
I don't think so. I mean, the fact is that there are a lot of things about the Islamic Republic that we don't like, and President Trump doesn't like, and I don't like. But that doesn't change the fact that there are reasons for engaging with the Islamic Republic and speaking to it. But in terms of President Trump, I don't think he cares about Iran at all. He has other motivations.
But so what are the other motivations? Because does he care about facts either? I mean, everyone has spoken about the fact that Iran has actually fulfilled its part of the bargain, but it seems the warmongers in the White House behind us and within the administration are intent on confronting Iran and perhaps even taking the region to another war.
That is true. There's a group out there, Ghida, I call them the chess beaters. Over Iran, and they've been beating their chest about Iran for 40 years. Now, ask yourself, if you beat your chest for 40 years, what results do you get? A sore chest, and that's about the extent of it. In terms of President Trump, I don't think he could find Iran on the map. I think Iran is a woman's name, and I think he thinks Iran is the trophy wife of some Baku oligarch or something like that.
And it has led many people to actually almost make fun of the whole idea of Trump undoing everything that President Obama did before him, that he simply doesn't seem to like the signature that is on any kind of agreement.
No, that's very clear. He is obsessed with undoing the work of his predecessor. But it's very clear that if Obama negotiated a deal, by definition, by Donald Trump's definition, it has to be a bad deal. Because after all, he is the world's greatest negotiator, if you believe him.
And he could certainly make a better deal, or at least so he believes. But here he isn't just going against the intelligence that's being provided by so many around the world, including the IAEA, but his own intelligence, the State Department's own intelligence. Let me just ask you, though, about the threat that many here in the US, at least, say Iran still poses. As someone who knows the country well, lived there even before you joined the Foreign Service, speaks Farsi, knows the politics and the culture. How much of a threat does Iran pose today? Is it justified, or is it completely overblown?
A threat to whom? A threat to whom, Ghida? That's the question. When you talk about a threat, what is the threat, and whom do they threaten?
Well, does it pose a threat to the U.S.
I
and
would
its
say,
allies?
in the first instance, Iran threatens the government in Iran threatens its own people more than anything. Look what it has dragged them through. It has dragged them into wars. It has dragged them into isolation. It has dragged them into repression.
But that was also at the behest of the United States. If we're talking about the war that it was dragged into against Iraq.
That is definitely a threat. That is definitely a threat. The threat to
a threat to Israel, because Israel constantly says that Iran poses an existential threat to it.
Israel loves that, or at least the regime there. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu must have gone into mourning when Ahmadinejad left office. He was the perfect enemy. With this new, somewhat more rational group, they have a very difficult time.
But you said earlier that the Iranians have dragged their own country into many wars and crises. Do you then feel that Iran somehow needs to be kept in check, as President Trump is suggesting?
Kept in check for what? Iran is already...
For what the Israelis and the Americans and the Saudis say are its aggressive policies in the region.
Well, again, ask yourself, who is saying this and for what purpose? Iran is already isolated in its region. Its history is ethnically isolated, is religiously isolated, geographically isolated, and it desperately is seeking some kind of passport, some kind of entree into the region. For me, that explains a lot of the anti-Israeli rhetoric that comes out.
And of course, there's that nexus, right, isn't there, between Saudi Arabia and Israel now towards confronting Iran?
That's a very strange phenomenon. It's good you pointed out. The Iranians have a nice saying. They say, politics has no father and no mother, and that's certainly what we're seeing now. But you know, the Saudis are an interesting case. If it were in their interest, they would deal with Iran as well. At the moment, though, they are terrified that this divorced couple, the U.S. and Iran, will somehow get back together.
And to what extent has Trump weakened the moderates in Iran, the reformists, those who had argued alongside President Rouhani that it's time to trust the West, we can do business with them? What does it send to the highly educated, vibrant, young society within Iran itself?
I think it does two things. One is when the president in his statements, or whoever wrote his statements, say how much he loves the Iranian people, the hypocrisy just oozes from the words. It's very clear. The second thing is for the chess beaters and the war hawks, the best thing that could happen to them would be for the extremists to take power in Iran, and that would simply fulfill their dreams.
But what is their dream? Finally, the end game. What is it? Is it regime change and nothing else?
Some kind of regime change. I mean, look, John Bolton, Rudy Giuliani, and Elaine Chao and others have taken money from these neo-Jonestown, neo-Khmer Rouge cultists called the MEK. They make speeches for them. They take their money. This is a detested group.
How is this going to
end? In Iran.
How is this ending?
I was a diplomat for 35 to 40 years. I'm always hopeful, but it's hard to see this ending well at this point.
Ambassador Limbert, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rita.
Thank you. President Trump derided the Iran agreement as a terrible deal, and in pulling out, he ignored the advice of key allies and senior members of his cabinet. Their message that the deal was the best way of keeping Iran's nuclear program in check. James Champion has our 5 facts.
Iran's nuclear stockpile has been reduced by 98%. Before the deal, Iran had 10,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, the fuel needed for nuclear power or nuclear weapons. Under the deal, it is allowed just 3,000 kilograms for peaceful purposes. Weapons-grade uranium is 90% enriched. In the past, Iran had enriched uranium up to 20%, but under the deal, it's only allowed to 3.67%, the level needed for generating power. Iran has dismantled most of its centrifuges. These are the devices used to enrich uranium. In 2001, Iran was thought to have just a few hundred of them. By 2015, it had built 19,000, despite heavy economic sanctions. But under the deal, Iran is allowed just over 6,000, removing more than 13,000 and placing them under international monitoring. The deal puts Iran further away from a possible nuclear weapon. Breakout time is how long it would take a country to develop enough nuclear material for a bomb. Before the deal, the US government estimated this at around 2 months for Iran. Now it is said to be at least 1 year, if the deal collapses. Inspectors say Iran is meeting its commitments. Inspectors from the nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, have issued 10 reports since the deal, all saying Iran is keeping to the agreement. In the first year after the deal was implemented, inspectors carried out 400 site visits and 25 snap inspections. In 2017, they spent 3,000 days in the field, but so far they haven't requested access to any sensitive military sites, which Iran says are off-limits. Iran has committed never to develop nuclear weapons. Some restrictions in the deal have a time limit and will begin expiring from 2026. These are known as sunset clauses and are common in international treaties, but Iran has made a permanent commitment not to develop nuclear weapons as part of the 2015 deal and the Global Weapons Pact, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Under both of these, there are mechanisms to inspect and verify Iran's nuclear program.
So let's examine all this with our guest. Mary Kaczynski is the Deputy Director of Policy at Plowshares Fund. She was previously the Nuclear Policy Analyst at the American Security Project. And Alexander Titus is a policy advisor at American First Policies. Mary Kaczynski, your organization was one of the main lobby groups that worked with the Obama administration to secure the Iran deal. Some of your detractors have been saying that you may have had vested economic interest. Why, from your perspective, is it so important now to save this deal?
The Iran deal blocked Iran's paths to a nuclear weapon. All of those pathways were blocked. It put in place an unprecedented, intrusive verification and monitoring regime. No country in the world had been subject to these kinds of inspections and monitoring that the Iran deal put in place. Without this deal, we might lose access to those inspectors. Iran could legitimately resume its nuclear activities. This is a serious threat. It's a danger to the entire world. It's in particular a danger to US allies in the region, including Israel.
So when Trump says that the agreement actually, and the terms of the agreement would have allowed Iran to build a nuclear weapon within 7 years, how accurate or misleading is this? Because after all, Iran wasn't and isn't still part of this agreement, but it's also a signatory to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which forbids any country to actually develop nuclear weapons, doesn't it?
Absolutely. President Trump's statements that the deal allows Iran to build nuclear weapons are quite simply incorrect. Iran was blocked from building a nuclear weapon. It committed to never pursuing a nuclear weapon in accordance with its commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, some of the limits of the Iran deal expired after 7 years. Ideally, we would have negotiated longer terms for the agreement, but by pulling out of the deal and killing it now, we've lost that opportunity.
So, a lost opportunity, Alex Titus. You just heard Mary say that this was the most intrusive regime any country has ever subjected itself to. All paths were closed to Iran to ever develop a nuclear weapon. So a red herring when we hear the president say that that was not the case?
So I think we should be proud of President Trump for removing the United States from this deal. And basically what Iran's ultimate goal was here was a path, a strategic and patient path to acquiring a nuclear weapon.
But you know that that isn't true, because it not only is bound by this agreement, and by the way, it did not violate the agreement, the United States did, but it's also, we just said, a party to the NPT. How exactly would it build a nuclear weapon? I mean, wouldn't it, if that was the intention, get out of the NPT just like North Korea did in 2003, like Israel never did? Why is it still there?
There's plenty of countries that sign on to international agreements that have no enforcement or no will to actually join some of these agreements. I mean, Syria has signed on to a number of international agreements and UN resolutions, and they're literally gassing their own people. By the way,
but Iran signed on to it willfully since 1970, and it is still in the JCPOA. What more does the Trump administration want from Iran at this stage?
So we'll see. We know we did not have access to all the military sites that we wanted to. We know there was sunset clauses in the agreement, which would have eventually allowed Iran to actually develop and enrich enough uranium to have a nuclear weapon. And we know that they have an intent to develop a nuclear weapon. We just saw Prime Minister Netanyahu last week come out with documents which were from the early 2000s and late 2000s that said that Iran obviously had intentions to eventually develop nuclear weapons.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, Mary, let me have you answer first, and also just perhaps mention that the State Department's own recent report on non-proliferation, published just last April, a few weeks ago, actually said that Iran was fulfilling every part of this agreement. And I think you'll recall that back in, was it 2007? The NIE the National Intelligence Estimate. All 17 US intelligence agencies said that Iran was no longer pursuing a nuclear weapon. But let me listen to what counter-argument you have.
That's absolutely correct. There was nothing new in Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation. All of those documents had been previously examined by the International Atomic Energy Agency, by US intelligence estimates. So there was nothing new there. It's all very clear. We've known for a very long time that Iran did pursue a nuclear weapons program prior to 2003.
What level of credibility and trust can the US now have with anyone, with the Iranians going forward, but also with North Korea and any other country that wants to pursue nuclear weapons, when it's just as easy, it seems, to undo a signature as it is to put one on any agreement?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's pretty clear that President Trump has undermined US credibility. He's done that a number of times. This is just the latest step.
But how important is this one?
I think it's really important to remember that when we talk about reimposing sanctions on Iran, we're actually talking about imposing sanctions on European allies, European companies that we need alongside us in order to negotiate a new deal. If we're really willing to sanction the UK and France and Germany and our allies, we have no leverage. We're not willing to do that.
It's a good idea, this rift that you're creating, the US administration has created with its own allies in the region, the Europeans. Will you sanction?
You just said allies in the region. To be clear, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, and Kingdom of Bahrain all praised the president for his stance of pulling out of the deal. So I think those are allies that get left out of the conversation a lot of the time when they're the ones who actually have to deal with the impacts on the ground.
But they obviously have an ulterior motive. I mean, it's all regime change, isn't it? What they want to see is this government no longer exist. I mean, what do you make of the fact that Saudi Arabia immediately said that it too might think of developing nuclear weapons if Iran went ahead and restarted its uranium enrichment? Is that a good thing? Because the administration said not a word about this.
I mean, I don't think anyone thinks it's a good thing for war regimes to have nuclear weapons, but in terms of Saudi Arabia is, and these different Arab countries and Israel, the ones who actually have to deal with the negative impacts on their border. So I think it's interesting with a lot of these European countries who obviously we need to work with and obviously we need to ensure that they're sort of taken care of as our allies, but they're not actually the ones who have to deal with the negative effects on their doorsteps of this deal.
So how reckless, how short-sighted does this all look to you, Mary? I mean, the director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, put it simply. She says this is an incredibly stupid decision. But is it more than that? Is it recklessly dangerous if other countries in the region, in addition to Israel, we all know has nuclear weapons, goes ahead and develops some?
It's very dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. And it's very clear that the Trump administration has no plan to prevent other nations from developing nuclear weapons. When the White House press secretary was asked about Saudi Arabia's threat to pursue nuclear weapons if Iran does, the White House press secretary said, "I don't believe we have a policy on that." So it's quite clear the Trump administration has no strategy. They haven't thought this through, and it's a very serious danger for allies in the region and for the entire world.
It looks here to many people watching objectively that this administration is ready to embrace a regime that not only flouted all international agreements, went ahead and built nuclear weapons, and it sanctioned one that actually had fulfilled its part of the nuclear bargain. What message does that send?
So I think in terms of the agreement with North Korea, this sends a really strong message to Kim Jong-un and his regime that while the United States does hope we can achieve peace and while we are looking for a deal, we're not going to sign on to a bad deal. And in terms of to put not only the American people at risk, but potentially our South Korean and Japanese allies at risk by signing a deal that we know will give significant leverage and significant power back to Kim Jong-un's regime. So I think in terms of when you hear critics say that us pulling out of the Iran deal gives us less leverage over North Korea, I actually think that it's the opposite.
But do you seriously think that Kim Jong-un will go ahead? I mean, he's announced his intention to close nuclear testing sites, but you really think that he is actually going to forego all of his nuclear capabilities?
Well, we'll have to see what happens. I mean, North Korea is in a significant better position than Iran was during the actual negotiation of the deal. So I think that it will be really interesting. But I think in some ways the regime is actually just taking on a lot of pressure from different countries such as China, which have largely closed down trade between the Chinese and North Korean border. So I think it will be very interesting to sort of come into this and see sort of what the demands of the Trump administration are and what denuclearization actually looks like.
Mary Kaczynski, how do you think North Korea and Kim Jong-un come into this? What incentive do they have to actually fulfill their part of the bargain here?
Kim Jong-un has one incentive. He wants legitimacy. He wants recognition on the world stage. He already got that from President Trump. Secretary of State Pompeo said he has confidence that Kim Jong-un will follow through on this agreement. In reality, Kim Jong-un is giving up nothing, or they haven't yet. They've given up very little. The Trump administration is prepared to cave.
And do you think Trump's decision on Iran will make Kim Jong-un think twice, in fact?
Absolutely. I think the Trump administration has shown time and again they can't be trusted to follow through on these agreements. If they say they're going to waive sanctions, Trump may change his mind the next day.
Well, that can easily happen, as we've seen. Alex Titus, a final question to you. Trump obviously needs a success. We all know that he might actually spin it as a historical success story, no matter what happens. But beyond that, can we expect anything of substance?
Well, the meeting itself, I mean, is very impressive, and 80% of Americans actually approve of them having the meeting together.
But he was Rocket Man just yesterday. Haven't you already given him way too much?
I mean, he was Rocket Man just yesterday, as you said, but I mean, I think the idea of actually trying to have sort of diplomatic relationships, actually trying to get both folks to the table, actually trying to have some of these discussions and see if there's any room that the United States, South Korea, and North Korea can work with. I mean, I think that that's a good thing, and I think that the majority of the American public would want to see us taking that diplomatic approach, dealing with Kim Jong-un, considering the position that he's in right now.
Alex Titus and Mary Kaczynski, thank you both very much indeed for your insights. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So the future of the Iran deal remains uncertain, but what is clear is that President Trump is making his mark on US foreign policy. With the stroke of a pen, he canceled the main international achievement of his predecessor, Barack Obama. Critics have drawn comparisons with Iraq, questionable intelligence deployed to suit an aggressive agenda with little thought given to the consequences. And after Trump moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, peace with the Palestinians is looking further away than ever. And as many people fear, the US president's decisions could be moving the Middle East into a more dangerous new phase. From me, Ghida, Fakhry, and all of the team here, thanks for watching.